It was one of those sullen English afternoons when the rain falls as though out of habit rather than conviction, dampening everything with a kind of weary impartiality. Lord Peter Wimsey, seated at a walnut pianoforte in the drawing-room of Greywood Hall, had just finished demonstrating to his host the proper interpretation of a Bach fugue when a small but decisive sound from the far corridor intruded on the cadence, a note, singular and persistent, like a child stubbornly pressing a key and refusing to lift the finger. "Middle C," said Wimsey, cocking his head, or rather, something approximating it. "Your piano tuner must be in revolt." Sir Ambrose Tregennis, the owner of the hall and of several opinions about music, shifted uneasily. "It's Mrs. Carlo at her practice again. She says it soothes her nerves." "Or someone else's," murmured Wimsey. He rose, brushed an invisible speck of dust from his sleeve, and ambled to the door. "But she cannot possibly be practicing a single note for 20 minutes unless she aspires to some avant-garde martyrdom." How very modern, Sir Ambrose followed. "She's been at it all week, same note, same hour." The staff are half out of their minds. "Then perhaps she is experimenting on you all," said Wimsey lightly. "An acoustic water torture, drip, drip, drip in C natural." The corridor smelt faintly of beeswax and something else, old velvet perhaps, or old fears. A heavy door stood ajar at the end, and from it came that steady, unrelenting sound. It was not loud, but it was curiously insistent, like the hum of a telephone unanswered. Wimsey paused outside the music room. No modulations, no excursions into F-sharp minor, merely C natural. Fascinating. "Shall we peek?" Sir Ambrose hesitated. "She does not like to be disturbed." "Then we shall disturb her only in the interests of musical scholarship," said Wimsey, and opened the door. Mrs. Carlo sat rigid at the grand piano, her right hand poised over the keyboard. The single note still sounded, not from her finger, which trembled above the key, but from the instrument itself, as though the wood had learned to sing of its own accord. "Good heavens," said Sir Ambrose, "she's not even touching it." Wimsey crossed the room, his footfalls soft on the Persian rug. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Carlo," he said gently. "An intriguing experiment in sustained tone, if I may say so." The woman turned her head slowly. She was pale, elegant in a washed-out way, and her eyes looked not at him, but through him. "I can't stop it," she whispered. "It plays itself." Wimsey examined the keyboard. The middle C was depressed, true, but by no visible agency. He tried the neighboring keys. They responded normally. "A ghostly accompanist, eh?" he murmured. Then, to Mrs. Carlo, "Would you be so good as to rise for a moment?" She did, unsteadily. The note continued. Wimsey bent, ran a finger along the underside of the keyboard, and frowned. No wedge, no string caught. Curious. He straightened and gave a little laugh that was mostly for Sir Ambrose's benefit. "Perhaps your tuner is indeed a revolutionary. Or perhaps," he added more quietly, "someone wishes to drive you all quite mad." Sir Ambrose cleared his throat. "Mrs. Carlo has been unwell since her husband's death last winter. He was a composer, left her nothing but debts and this piano, and a single note for company," said Wimsey. "How touching." At that moment a footman appeared at the door, his face the colour of cold porridge. "Beg pardon, sir," he said to Sir Ambrose, "but Mr. Benwick, he's been found in the West Garden." "Dead, echoed Sir Ambrose. "Stone dead, sir." "Looks like he fell from the terrace." Mrs. Carlo gave a soft cry, and the note on the piano stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Wimsey looked at the instrument, then at the woman, then back at the instrument. "Extraordinary timing," he said. "One might almost think the piano had been waiting for the cue." He moved to the window. Beyond the dripping panes, the West Garden lay in its sodden autumnal beauty, gravel paths glistening, box hedges sagging with rain. Somewhere out there, a man lay dead. "Well," said Whimsy, almost cheerfully, "this promises to be more diverting than bark." He turned to the footman. "Show me, if you please. And have someone see to Mrs. Carlo. She looks as though she has heard enough sea natural for a lifetime." Sir Ambrose spluttered. But Lord Peter, should we not call the police?" "By all means. But while you telephone, I shall take a preliminary stroll. Fresh air, you know, and a little look at where Mr. Benwick met his untimely finale." He offered Mrs. Carlo a small bow, ironic yet courteous, and stepped into the corridor. The rain had intensified. It pattered against the mullioned windows like muted applause. Whimsy's eyes were bright with interest. A self-playing note, a dead man in the garden, a widow at the keys. Ingredients, he thought, for a most intriguing fugue. As he reached for his hat and stick in the vestibule, the butler, an elderly man with the complexion of carved tallow, whispered, "Begging your pardon. Pardon, my lord, but there's been queer goings-on all week. The bell in the clock tower chimed 13 on Tuesday, and the kitchen cat won't go near the music room." "How very Gothic," said Whimsy, slipping into his coat. "Let us hope the explanations prove less so. Still, 13 strikes is a delightful touch. Reminds me of Wilkie Collins." He stepped out into the wet grey afternoon, the footman trailing behind. The gravel crunched underfoot. The air smelled of damp stone and autumn leaves. Somewhere, a rook cawed like a stage prompter clearing its throat. At the edge of the terrace, he stopped and surveyed the scene below. Mr. Benwick, the estate's music master, lay crumpled at the base of a flight of mossy steps, his limbs at angles unbecoming to a living man. The rain had plastered his hair to his skull and blurred the ink stains on his fingers. Whimsy tilted his head. A fall, perhaps. Or a push. Or a fall encouraged by a push, but why at this hour, and why on this particular day of middle sea? He crouched, inspecting the ground. Mud clung to Benwick's shoes, but the steps above were dry under the eaves. "He did not slip here," Whimsy murmured. "He arrived here." Behind him the footman shifted uneasily. "Shall I fetch the constable, my lord?" "In due course," said Whimsy. "First, let us look at the stage before the audience arrives." He drew from his pocket a small magnifying glass, flicked it open, and examined the moss between the stones. "Ah," he said softly. "There you are." He straightened, closed the glass, and slipped it back into his pocket. "Very good. I think we may begin the performance. Act 1. A persistent note. Act 2. A man in the garden. Curtain still up." He looked back at the great house. The music-room windows glowed faintly. Somewhere inside, Mrs. Carlo sat alone with her piano, and perhaps with other company besides. "Come along," said Whimsy to the footman. "We shall need tea, strong and perhaps a scone, and then we shall talk about Mr. Benwick and the curious acoustics of Greywood Hall." The footman swallowed. "Acoustics, my lord?" "Why, yes," said Whimsy, smiling thinly. "Acoustics and timing, always timing. Murder, like music, depends upon the right note struck at the right moment." He raised his hat fractionally to the dead man, as though acknowledging a fellow performer, and then turned back toward the hall. Lord Peter Whimsy had always maintained that a house's true character was revealed not in its drawing-rooms, but in its kitchens. Greywood Hall, for all its faded grandeur upstairs, boasted a cavernous underworld of flagstone floors, dark oak dressers, and the mingled smells of beeswax, coal dust, and yesterday's haddock. Here, among the copper pans and damp tea-towels, the house breathed in its natural accent, unvarnished by polite company. Whimsy descended the back staircase, his footsteps echoing. The butler had been dispatched to telephone the police. Sir Ambrose was presumably wringing his hands over sherry. Whimsy, humming a scrap of Purcell, reached the kitchen door and tapped lightly. Inside, the staff had gathered in a cluster of uneasy silhouettes. The cook, a stout woman with arms folded like fortifications, eyed Whimsy with open suspicion. Beside her stood a thin housemaid clutching a damp apron and a scullery boy whose ears stuck out like semaphore flags. In the corner, the footman who had discovered Benwick hovered like a bad conscience. "Good evening," said Whimsy cheerfully, as though he had strolled in for a recipe. "I find myself in need of a little enlightenment, and I understand the downstairs department is always better informed than the upstairs." No one answered. A coal scuttle clanged faintly as the boy shifted his weight. Whimsy removed his hat, tilted it rakishly, and perched on the edge of a scrubbed table. "You all knew Mr. Benwick, of course." "The unfortunate music master. A fall in the garden, so I am told." The cook sniffed. "He weren't no gentleman," she said, "always prowling about, up at all hours, scribbling on scraps of paper. And that piano business. Well, it gave me the shivers." "What piano business?" asked Whimsy mildly. "That Mrs. Carlo sitting in there like a wax figure and him hovering behind, telling her what note to play. Over and over, the same one. Like they were summoning something." The housemaid crossed herself quickly, then blushed. "Beg pardon, sir. Only it seemed, well, unholy." "Ah," said Whimsy. "A ritual in C natural. Most unorthodox. And when did you last see Mr. Benwick?" "About an hour before dinner, sir," the footman answered. "He was in the west corridor with Mrs. Carlo. Said something about needing air." "I didn't hear the rest." Whimsy drew from his pocket a small notebook, its cover scuffed and bearing a faint scent of pipe tobacco. He jotted a few words, then looked up. "And has Mrs. Carlo seemed altered of late?" the housemaid whispered. "She cries at night, sir." "We hear her. And sometimes she goes to the music room after midnight. No lights on, only the piano. Plays that same note." Whimsy shut the notebook with a snap. "One can hardly blame her for nerves. Bereavement, debts, a haunted piano, trying circumstances. Still, your evidence is invaluable." He rose, brushing flour from his trousers. "Tell me, does anyone else have a fondness for midnight wanderings?" "Sir Ambrose. Guests, ghosts of ancient butlers." A brief titter ran around the kitchen, quickly stifled. The cook said, "Sir Ambrose never leaves his room after 10, sir. He's that regular. You could set a clock by him." "An admirable quality," said Whimsy. "Though clocks have been known to lie." He smiled at the boy. "And you, my young friend? Have you seen anything the grown-ups haven't?" The boy gulped. "Only the cat, sir. It went into the music room last night and came out like it had seen a ghost. Tail all puffed, scratched me too." He displayed a red line on his hand. Whimsy examined it gravely. "A testimonial, no less. Animals are excellent witnesses, though rarely articulate." "Thank you." He produced a wrapped sweet from his pocket and handed it to the boy, who stared at it as though it might explode. "Now," said Whimsy, "if you'll excuse me, I must reconnoiter the village." A house is one thing, a village quite another. Secrets seep downward like water. He gave a little bow and departed by the scullery door, stepping into the damp dusk. The village of Greywood crouched in the valley like a row of grey teeth. Whimsy, striding under his umbrella, found the inn, the King's Harp, glowing with lamplight. Inside, the air smelled of wet wool, beer, and gossip. Farmers, tradesmen, and one or two minor gentry huddled around tables. The innkeeper, a ruddy man with a face like a well-scrubbed ham, looked up as Whimsy entered. "Evening, my lord." "Wet night for a walk." "Excellent for thinking," said Whimsy. "I wondered if I might trouble you for a pint and a scrap of information." The pint arrived, frothing like a modest volcano. Whimsy sipped, then leaned on the bar. "Tell me about Mr. Benwick." "Popular fellow. The innkeeper's expression soured. Music master? Never trusted him, always asking about the old clock tower, making sketches. Said he wanted to measure the chimes. Odd bird, the chimes, said Whimsy. Aye, the tower bell's been off for yours. Sometimes it strikes wrong. Tuesday night it struck 13 at midnight. Gave the village a turn. Delicious, murmured Whimsy. And Mrs. Carlo? Does she ever come down here? Not her. Keeps to herself. But Benwick. He came in Tuesday after the bell struck wrong, white as a sheet, said someone was watching him from the hall window. No one was there, though. We looked Whimsy's eyes half closed. Fascinating. Thank you. He drained his pint, set it down, and tapped the bar twice with a finger. One more question. Any talk of an inheritance? Or a quarrel? The innkeeper lowered his voice. Benwick was no music master. Not really. Word is he was Mrs. Carlo's husband's copyist. He knew all the manuscripts, all the debts. Some say he threatened to expose something about Sir Ambrose, too. Whimsy smiled faintly. How admirably Victorian. Threats, manuscripts, midnight bells, and a single note at the piano. All we lack is a secret passage. He paid, doffed his hat, and stepped back into the night. The rain had eased to a mist. Greywood Hall loomed up the hill, its windows yellow as old parchment. As he walked, Whimsy hummed a descending scale, then stopped. No, he said aloud. It cannot be that simple. Not yet. He looked back toward the village, then up at the hall's dark tower where the clock lay silent. Timing, he murmured. Always timing. When Lord Peter Whimsy returned to Greywood Hall, the mist had settled low upon the lawns, rendering the yews as solemn and motionless as chessmen. He paused on the gravel, sniffing the damp air like a hound on a scent, then entered through the side door. Inside, the hall glowed with lamplight and tension. Sir Ambrose was in the library, pacing before the cold hearth, while Inspector Priest of the County Constabulary had just arrived, a man of solid build and stolid manner whose moustache seemed to bristle with indignation at any disruption of order. I have made a preliminary examination, Priest was saying as Whimsy strolled in. The deceased, Benwick, has a broken neck and bruises consistent with a fall. But there are footprints on the terrace steps not matching his boots. Smaller, lighter, Sir Ambrose looked relieved and guilty at once. Then it was murder? It may be, said Priest, though it may equally be a scuffle or an accident with a witness. We shall know more in the morning. Whimsy warmed his hands at the fire, as though the entire exchange were a private entertainment. And where, he asked mildly, is Mrs. Carlo? In her room, Sir Ambrose answered. Doctor's given her a draught. Poor woman is beside herself. Understandably, murmured Whimsy, though one wonders whether herself is worth being beside. He turned to Priest. You have interviewed the household? Beginning with the staff, yes. Most unhelpful. They say Benwick was always about at odd hours, meddling with the piano, quarrelling with Mrs. Carlo. No love lost there. Quarrelling, eh? Whimsy's eyes lit with polite interest. About what? Money, Priest said grimly. Benwick claimed Mrs. Carlo owed him for copyist work, threatened to expose her late husband's debts. She, for her part, accused him of stealing manuscripts. Splendid, said Whimsy. Nothing like a financial motive to put a bit of colour into the cheeks. And Sir Ambrose, you saw nothing. Sir Ambrose spluttered. I was in the billiard room, heard the bell strike the hour, but nothing else. I never dreamed. Few people do, said Whimsy gently. But one must always ask what was being rehearsed behind the curtain. He crossed to the sideboard and examined a silver salver with idle fingers. This is dented, he remarked. A trivial observation, of course. Sir Ambrose blinked. It's been dented for years. Ah, then it will not form the basis of a confession. Pity Whimsy turned back. Inspector, may I offer a suggestion? Priest raised an eyebrow. if you must. Interview Mrs. Carlo at once, if her condition allows. The timing of her piano performance and Benwick's death is too neat to ignore. She may have been hypnotized by the note, or merely hypnotizing others. Either way, she's your obvious suspect, Sir Ambrose started. But surely, calm yourself, said Whimsy. Obvious suspects are necessary. They provide the background against which the less obvious may shine. Surprise. The interview with Mrs. Carlo took place in her dimly lit bedroom. She lay propped among pillows, pale as candle wax, hands clasped upon a lavender shawl. Inspector Priest stood at the foot of the bed like an angry schoolmaster. Whimsy loitered by the mantelpiece, examining a row of photographs in silver frames. "Madam," Priest began, "I regret to trouble you at such a time, but we must ask where. You were at the moment Mr. Benwick died." Mrs. Carlo's lips trembled. "In the music room." "As always at that hour. Playing the piano?" Priest asked. "Yes," she whispered. "The same note? He insisted upon it?" "Insisted?" Whimsy interjected lightly. "But Benwick was in the garden, was he not?" She closed her eyes. "He said it must continue even if he left. He said it was essential to his composition. He had me playing that one note for hours, for days. He said it was an experiment in resonance." A sob escaped her. "I hated it," Priest scribbled. "And tonight? Tonight he told me to begin at 7 and not stop until he returned. I did as he asked. Then the note began to play itself. I felt faint. I thought perhaps I had gone mad." "Then you did not leave the room?" Priest asked sharply. "No. Did you hear anything? A cry, a scuffle?" "Nothing but the note," she whispered. Whimsy set down a photograph and approached the bed. "And your relationship with Mr. Benwick, strictly professional?" She gave him a haunted look. "He was my husband's shadow. He knew all our secrets. He threatened to publish letters that would ruin me and Sir Ambrose, who had hovered at the doorway, colored deeply." "Nonsense," he muttered. Whimsy smiled thinly. "How melodramatic. And yet convenient. Inspector, may I hazard that Mrs. Carlo is your current favorite for the role of villain?" Priest snapped his notebook shut. "She had motive and opportunity. And if the piano was a ruse, well, we shall see." Whimsy bowed slightly to Mrs. Carlo. "Rest, madam. Music can be deadly to the nerves." Later, in the library, Whimsy stretched out in an armchair and lit a cigarette. "Well, Inspector, you have your prima donna suspect. But do you also have her score?" Priest scowled. "We shall examine the piano tomorrow. I'll post a constable outside her door tonight." "Excellent," said Whimsy. "But indulge me in a small eccentricity. Could you also send someone to the clock tower? Something about that bell strikes me as, well, off-key." "Off-key?" Priest repeated. "Exactly." Whimsy flicked ash into the grate. "A piano that plays itself, a bell that strikes 13, a dead man at the foot of the terrace. The arrangement is elegant, but I suspect the composer may not be Mrs. Carlo." Sir Ambrose wrung his hands. "Then who?" "That," said Whimsy, smiling like a cat at a mouse hole, "is the part of the fugue we have yet to hear." Breakfast at Greywood Hall the following morning was a hushed affair. The rain had stopped, leaving the lawns glittering under a washed-out sun. Sir Ambrose sat at the head of the table, staring into his kipper as though it might leap up and accuse him. Mrs. Carlo had not appeared. Inspector Priest, summoned at dawn to examine the piano, had already gone, out to the clock tower. Lord Peter Whimsy, by contrast, was in enviable spirits. He buttered his toast with the air of a man composing a limerick and hummed a few bars of The Harmonious Blacksmith. "Too cheerful by half," Sir Ambrose muttered. "A man dead, my household in turmoil, and you humming Handel. Purely diagnostic, said Whimsy. "Handel for breakfast, Purcell for luncheon, Bach for midnight murders." He looked up, eyes twinkling. "Tell me, Sir Ambrose, your bell tower, who winds the clock?" "The gardener," Sir Ambrose replied blankly. "Why?" "No reason at all, merely professional curiosity. Bells, clocks, chiming mechanisms. Deliciously medieval. Do you know if the clock keeps proper time?" "It's been erratic for years," Sir Ambrose said. "I mean to have it repaired." Whimsy's smile widened. "Erratic clocks are such good companions to erratic murders. One never knows whether one is early or late." He took another bite of toast, then, as if struck by an afterthought, asked, "And the curtains in the music room, have they been altered lately?" "The curtains?" "Yes. Color, length, thickness?" Sir Ambrose blinked. "I suppose they're the same old red velvet they've always been. Heavy things." "Why?" "Red velvet absorbs sound rather well," said Whimsy. "Though not middle C, that one does travel." Sir Ambrose set down his fork. "Lord Peter, what on earth are you implying?" "Implying," Whimsy repeated innocently. "Nothing at all. Only that architecture and textiles sometimes tell more truth than people." Later that morning, Whimsy wandered the hall like a distracted tourist. He measured the distance between the music room door and the west terrace with a pair of his own shoes, counted steps aloud, then stooped to inspect a small brass grill near the skirting board. He asked a passing maid how often the chimneys were swept. He inquired of the cook the exact hour she set the kitchen clock. He borrowed a tape measure from the butler and spent a cheerful quarter hour measuring the thickness of the walls in the corridor. The staff, already nervous, watched him as one might watch a benign but unpredictable animal. At last he returned to the music room. The piano sat in the morning light like a great black beetle. The single note that had haunted the house was silent. Inspector Priest stood beside it, frowning. "No trick I can find," said Priest. "Mechanism sound. No wires, no wedges. If it played itself, it did so by a miracle." "Or by excellent planning," said Whimsy. "Tell me, Inspector, have you timed the bell in the clock tower?" "Timed it?" "Yes. Does it strike exactly on the hour, or a little before or a little after?" Priest scowled. "It strikes when it strikes. Half the time it's wrong." "Splendid," murmured Whimsy. "A clock that lies, a bell that misleads, and a piano that complains. We have all the makings of a symphony." He bent over the keyboard, played a soft arpeggio, and listened to the echo. "The curtains dampen the treble, but the bass carries." "Interesting." He stood, dusting his hands. "I should like to see Mrs. Carlo now, if she's awake." Mrs. Carlo received them in the drawing-room, still pale but composed. She wore a grey morning dress and clutched a lace handkerchief. "I understand you played your note faithfully until the consternation in the garden," said Whimsy gently. "A difficult discipline." She gave him a wary glance. "I had no choice." "One always has choice," said Whimsy lightly, "even in music." "Did Benwick ever specify why it must be at that precise hour?" "He said the hall's acoustics were perfect at 7, she murmured. "Something about sympathetic vibration." He wanted to prove a theory. "Sympathetic vibration," repeated Whimsy. "Delightful phrase. And did you notice the bell?" "The bell?" "In the tower. It strikes oddly. Sometimes more than 12. She shivered. "I hate that bell. It sounds like a warning or a cue," said Whimsy. "You did not leave the room?" "No." "And you are certain Benwick left by the west corridor?" "I suppose so." "I didn't watch him go, indeed." Whimsy tapped his chin. "Thank you, Mrs. Carlo. You've been most helpful." He turned to Priest. "We must check every clock in the house, and every curtain, and every servant's memory of who went where when Priest looked exasperated." "Curtains?" Clocks. This is nonsense. On the contrary, said Whimsy, smiling like a man at a private joke. This is the music of the spheres, only our composer has botched the coda. That afternoon, while Priest busied himself with statements and Sir Ambrose sulked over cigars, Whimsy took a solitary walk around the hall's perimeter. He studied the line of windows from the outside, noting which were open, which shut. He paused beneath the tower, craned his neck, and counted the bell's cracks. He measured with his eyes the distance from the tower's narrow spiral stair to the west terrace where Benwick had died. In the gravel near the steps, he found a faint impression of a woman's heel. Small, pointed, nearly lost in the damp. He crouched, touched it, and smiled faintly. Timing, curtains, bells, he murmured, and footprints. Always the same rhythm, only different players. He straightened, brushed off his knees, and looked back at the hall. The sun had slipped behind a cloud, leaving the house in a sudden grey hush. Inside somewhere, a door closed softly. That evening at dinner, Whimsy entertained Sir Ambrose with an anecdote about a bishop and a music-hall singer, all the while noting which servant poured which wine at which moment. He asked about the age of the velvet draperies, the thickness of the hall carpets, the number of steps from the music room to the telephone. Each question was delivered with the innocence of a man discussing weather or cricket scores. Sir Ambrose grew visibly restive. "Do you never stop asking these ridiculous things?" "Never," said Whimsy. "One must collect pebbles before building a mosaic." He lifted his glass, catching the light. "To clocks, curtains, and carpets," he said, and drank. By the next morning, Greywood Hall had settled into that peculiar hush which follows a public scandal. The police had established a discreet presence. Constables drifted through the corridors like apologetic ghosts. Sir Ambrose, pale and polite, had taken to his study. Mrs. Carlo remained behind closed doors. Lord Peter Whimsy, however, was up before dawn, stalking the gravel paths with a notebook and a pocket watch. He was dressed for a country stroll, but moved with the focus of a man tuning an instrument. He began with the west terrace, standing at the top of the mossy steps where Benwick had been found. He timed his own descent, 8 seconds at a leisurely pace, 5 at a run. He noted the dampness under the eaves, the dryness of the steps where a slip would be impossible. He then walked from the music room door to the terrace, counting under his breath. 73 steps, he murmured, writing it down. 1 minute, 20 seconds at a brisk walk. At the foot of the steps, a constable watched nervously. "Looking for footprints again, my lord?" "Looking for footprints in time," said Whimsy. "They are harder to find, but more reliable." He produced a small tape measure, stretched it from the base of the stair to the edge of the gravel where Benwick had lain, and made another note. Then he shut his watch with a snap. Now for the bell. The clock tower rose out of the hall like an admonition. Its narrow spiral stair smelled of rust and pigeon droppings. Whimsy climbed, noting each creak and echo. Halfway up he paused at a slit window and peered out over the sodden grounds. In the pale light he could see the route from the hall to the terrace as clearly as a diagram. Inspector Priest was waiting at the top, frowning over the bell mechanism. "It's a shambles," he grunted. "Waits out of balance. Strikes when it pleases charming," said Whimsy. He examined the bell, tracing a hairline crack with his finger. "How long does it take to reach the terrace from here?" 2 minutes, perhaps, said Priest. Whimsy smiled. "Then one could say, ring a bell or adjust a weight and still arrive in time to push a man down steps." Priest's eyes narrowed. "You're suggesting someone was up here?" "Suggesting nothing," said Whimsy mildly. "Only timing possibilities. Murder, like music, is nothing without rhythm." He took from his pocket a small tuning fork, struck it, and held it up. The note hummed against the bell's iron. "Middle C," he said softly. "How obliging." Priest looked startled. "You think the bell and the piano?" "Think? I never think," said Whimsy. "I only listen. Come along, we've more distances to test." They descended and crossed to the music room. Mrs. Carlo had emerged at last, pale but composed. She sat in an armchair like a marionette whose strings had been loosened. "Madam," said Whimsy gently, "we are reconstructing the evening of Mr. Benwick's death. Will you humor me?" She nodded, eyes downcast. "Excellent. You began playing at 7 o'clock?" "Yes." "And Benwick left you at 7:10, perhaps. He said he needed air. You continued to play?" "Yes. I played until the note began on its own." "And at what time was that?" She hesitated. "I don't know. Perhaps past. I felt faint." Whimsy jotted this. "And the bell struck?" "It struck 8, but it sounded wrong." As though the note had moved inside the house, she pressed a handkerchief to her lips. "I thought I was losing my mind." "Quite," said Whimsy. "Inspector, please note, Benwick leaves at 7:10, bell strikes wrong at 8, body found at 8:15. Our suspect claims to have been at the piano throughout." Priest scribbled grudgingly. "And you believe her?" "I believe everyone until I don't," said Whimsy cheerfully. "Now, Mrs. Carlo, one more question. Did you notice the curtains last night?" "The curtains?" she repeated, bewildered. "Yes. Were they drawn?" Yes, they were. Benwick drew them before he left. He said the light distracted him." Whimsy smiled faintly. "Did he indeed?" "Thank you." Outside the room, Whimsy turned to Priest. "We must test the bell and the piano together. Strike the bell at a certain moment. Play the note, see how it carries." Priest gave him a hard look. "This isn't one of your club puzzles, Whimsy." "A man is dead." "Exactly," said Whimsy. "And puzzles kill more neatly than pistols. Come tonight at 7. Bring your constable. We shall reenact Benwick's experiment." The rest of the day Whimsy spent like a restless mathematician. He checked every clock in the hall, comparing them to his pocket watch. He found 3 running fast, 1 slow, and 1 stopped altogether. He inspected the carpets for worn patches, the staircases for hidden doors, the servants' schedules for anomalies. He even borrowed a small mirror from the housemaid and peered under the piano. To Sir Ambrose's repeated, "What on earth are you doing?" he replied only with, "Collecting notes for the score." By tea-time he had a diagram in his notebook resembling the plan of a small opera house: arrows, times, distances. At the bottom he had written, "Curtains drawn. Why? Bell. Cracked. Why? Middle C and tower. Why?" He closed the notebook, tucked it into his pocket, and smiled like a man hearing a faint melody at last twilight settled on Greywood Hall with a soft pewter light that turned the windows to dim mirrors. In the library, Inspector Priest paced like a man counting invisible bars. Lord Peter Whimsy sat in an armchair, long legs crossed, notebook open, a faint smile playing at his lips. "You've had your clocks and curtains," Priest said at last. "Now will you tell me what you're after?" "After?" said Whimsy. "Merely the truth. Though I do like it dressed for the theatre." He closed the notebook. "Shall we rehearse tonight's performance?" Priest stopped pacing. "Performance? The reenactment of Benwick's experiment, of course. Mrs. Carlo at the piano, the bell striking, the servants in their places. We shall see who misses a cue." At 7 precisely the household assembled in the music room. Mrs. Carlo, wan but composed, sat at the grand piano. The heavy red curtains were drawn. Sir Ambrose lurked near the mantelpiece, his face pale as candle grease. The staff had been marshalled to the corridor. Priest stationed a constable by the door, another in the tower. Whimsy strolled about, hands in pockets, humming. "Madame," he said to Mrs. Carlo, "begin, if you please." Middle C. She struck the key. The note resonated, flat and pure. She struck it again and again as she had on the fatal night. Priest's voice came sharp. "Bell ready?" From somewhere above came a muffled, "Aye, sir." "Strike on my word," Priest ordered. Whimsy tilted his head, listening to the note. "Now," he said quietly. A deep clang rolled down from the tower. The piano's note wavered. For an instant the two sounds merged, a bell and a key, a low hum threading through the house like a taut string. Sir Ambrose flinched. Mrs. Carlo went rigid, her hand hovering above the key as though pinned by an unseen nail. Whimsy moved to the window, pulled the curtain aside, and looked into the dusk. "There," he murmured. "Exactly as I thought." He let the curtain fall and turned back. "Thank you, madam." "That will do. Inspector, kindly release your orchestra." The constables dispersed. Mrs. Carlo sagged, tears in her eyes. "I can't bear it," she whispered. "It feels like he's still here." "Perhaps he is," said Whimsy softly. "Or perhaps someone else entirely." Later, in the library, Whimsy spread a sheaf of papers across the table. "I borrowed these from the late Mr. Carlo's study," he said. "Music manuscripts. But see, half are not music at all. They are ciphered letters," Sir Ambrose started. "What?" "Ciphered letters," Whimsy repeated. Benwick was not merely a copyist. He was a conduit. Your late brother-in-law, Sir Ambrose, wrote certain indiscreet communications under the guise of composition. Benwick copied them, kept the copies, and used them to extract money. Priest leaned over the papers. Letters to whom? Whimsy smiled. To investors, to creditors, to a certain lady in Vienna. Debts, affairs, promises. Benwick held all the strings. Mrs. Carlo was his reluctant accomplice. She played his note not only on the piano, but in society. Sir Ambrose's face went from pale to puce. "You mean blackmail?" "An ugly but accurate word," said Whimsy. Benwick had two lives, the public music master and the private extortionist. He used the hall's acoustics, the bell's irregular strikes, and Mrs. Carlo's fear to build a kind of ritual, part experiment, part intimidation. Priest frowned. "Why the single note?" "To break her nerve," said Whimsy. "A psychological metronome." Day after day she struck it at his command, until she associated it with guilt and submission. A very old trick, merely dressed up as avant-garde music. Mrs. Carlo, who had been silent, spoke in a low voice. "He said my husband had left debts. He said unless I cooperated he would ruin Sir Ambrose. I thought if I did as he asked, he would stop." Whimsy's tone softened. "My dear lady, extortionists never stop. They only shift key," she shuddered. "But I didn't kill him." "I know," said Whimsy quietly. Priest stared. "You know?" "I know she did not leave the music room," said Whimsy, "but someone else did. Someone who knew the timing of the bell, the layout of the hall, the pattern of her obedience. Someone who could arrive at the terrace unseen." Sir Ambrose's hand gripped the arm of his chair. "Yes, you can't mean—" "I mean nothing," said Whimsy lightly. "But a double life, once revealed, always has a counterpoint. Benwick was not the only one playing two parts." The next day, Whimsy walked with Priest around the grounds again. The inspector's moustache bristled with suspicion. "You're hinting at Sir Ambrose." "Am I?" said Whimsy. "I thought I was merely admiring the topiary. But note this. Benwick threatened to expose letters. Sir Ambrose stood to lose everything. Sir Ambrose had access to the tower and the bell. Sir Ambrose could have staged the experiment, drawing the curtains, instructing Mrs. Carlo, then slipping out by another door. "But the footprints," said Priest. "They were small." "Indeed," said Whimsy. And the hall has more than one pair of small shoes. He smiled. Perhaps we are dealing not with a straightforward push, but with a duet. Priest gave a low whistle. A duet? Why not? Murder, like music, often benefits from harmony. They reached the terrace steps. Whimsy knelt, brushed away a fallen leaf, and revealed the faint impression of a pointed heel. There, he said softly. Our second player. He straightened. Tonight, Inspector, we shall change the score. We shall let our suspects think the performance continues as before. Then we shall see who strikes the next note. That evening, alone in his room, Whimsy studied his diagram of the hall. He traced the arrows with a finger, hearing in his mind the echo of the bell, the thud of footsteps, the solitary piano note. A double life, a double path, a double timing. He smiled faintly. Almost ready for the coda, he murmured. But not yet. One more variation. First he closed the notebook, laid it on the bedside table, and extinguished the lamp. In the darkness, the house creaked and settled like an old instrument. Somewhere, faintly, a single note sounded, then stopped. The night at Greywood Hall smelled of wet stone and candle grease, the sort of night when sounds travel oddly and time feels stretched. Lord Peter Whimsy, leaning against the banister at the top of the main staircase, listened to the house settle. It was the hour before dinner, when the servants moved like discreet shadows, and Sir Ambrose shut himself into his study to drink without witnesses. The whole building felt like a stage with the curtain drawn, waiting for someone to cue the orchestra. Whimsy had spent the afternoon poring over his notes and diagrams. In the margin of one page he had circled a single phrase, "Window left ajar." It was a minor detail from the footman's first statement, easy to overlook. Yet, like a dissonant chord in an otherwise perfect fugue, it had stayed in his mind. Why a window? Why left ajar on that particular night and in that particular room? He moved down the corridor to the music room. It was empty now, the heavy red curtain still drawn. He touched the velvet, feeling how thickly it muffled the air, and then moved to the tall window at the far end. The latch had been slid but not fastened. A faint draught touched his fingers. Outside, the terrace steps fell away into darkness. "Ah," he murmured, "so you were the passage all along." He opened the window wider and leaned out. From here one could see the west garden and, beyond, the faint outline of the clock tower. The drop was not high, and the sill broad enough for a careful climber. A person could slip out unseen, circle the terrace, and return before the household knew anything was amiss. Footsteps behind him. Inspector Priest entered, looking harried. "I've been over every inch of the tower again. Nothing. What are you doing now?" "Revisiting an old friend," said Whimsy. "Do you recall the footman's statement about a window left ajar?" Priest frowned. "Vaguely." "This window," said Whimsy, "left open the night Benwick died. The curtains drawn, the bell striking, and Mrs. Carlo at the piano, dutifully keeping time. What an admirable cover." Priest came to the window, peered out, then back in. "You think someone slipped out here?" "I think someone wanted us to believe they couldn't have slipped out," said Whimsy. "But they could, and perhaps they did." Dinner that evening was a tense affair. Sir Ambrose picked at his fish, Mrs. Carlo toyed with a single asparagus spear. The servants moved silently. Whimsy, by contrast, was in expansive mood. He spoke of clocks and stagecraft, of how old monasteries had used bell timings to regulate hidden movements, and of how theater managers timed curtain drops to disguise backstage commotion. No one listened, but everyone heard. When the plates were cleared, he asked, quite casually, "Where is the silver salver that usually stands on the sideboard?" Sir Ambrose blinked. "The salver? Why do you ask?" "It was dented," said Whimsy. "I like dented things. They tell stories." the butler said stiffly. "The salver has gone to the pantry for polishing, my lord." "How thorough of you," murmured Whimsy. "Would you fetch it?" Moments later, the salver appeared, gleaming and dent-free. Whimsy examined it under the lamp. "Ah," he said softly. "Not the same one." Sir Ambrose stiffened. "Surely you're mistaken." "Possibly." Whimsy set it down. "But my memory for dents is rather good. This one lacks the small crescent mark near the rim. Curious. Perhaps you have two salvers." The butler hesitated. "It, may have been misplaced." "Misplaced," repeated Whimsy. "Like Mr. Benwick." He smiled pleasantly. "Do let me know when you find it." Later, in the library, he gathered Inspector Priest and Mrs. Carlo. The curtains were drawn against the dusk. The clock ticked loudly. "I've been thinking about last night's reenactment," Whimsy said. "Everything occurred exactly as before. The note, the bell, the drawn curtains. But one thing did not happen. No one died." "That's hardly surprising," muttered Priest. "On the contrary," said Whimsy. "If the ritual itself were lethal, someone should have fallen from the terrace again, but the ritual was only a distraction. The real action took place elsewhere. By this window, Mrs. Carlo's eyes widened. "You mean—" "I mean Benwick's death was timed to coincide with the bell in your note," said Whimsy, "so that his killer could slip out, push him, and slip back, all while you sat imprisoned by your obedience." She gripped the arm of her chair. "But who?" "That," said Whimsy, "is where the salver comes in. It vanished the night Benwick died." "Why? Because it was used as a mirror?" "A mirror," Priest said blankly. "Yes," said Whimsy, "to signal. The west garden is visible from the pantry window after dark if one knows where to look. A flash of reflected lamplight could cue the killer. Bell now, push now, return now. Stagecraft, Inspector. Timing and props." Priest rubbed his mustache. "So you're saying someone downstairs was signaling someone outside?" "Exactly," said Whimsy. "A duet, as I suggested. Benwick was not the only one leading a double life. Someone in this house knew of his blackmail, perhaps profited by it, and decided to end it before he ended them." He closed his notebook with a snap. "Tomorrow, Inspector, we shall let the orchestra play one more time, but we will change the script." That night, alone in his room, Whimsy sat at the small writing desk and drafted a letter. He wrote quickly, pausing only to underline a few phrases. Then he folded the sheet and sealed it with a dab of wax from the bedside candle. He placed it under the blotter where a constable could find it if things went awry. He rose, went to the window, and looked out at the dark grounds. Somewhere a fox barked. The tower bell, out of order, muttered a faint half-strike. "Almost there," he murmured. "Curtains, bells, windows, salver, all the props in place. All we need is our final act." He turned back to the desk, took up his notebook, and added a single line under the circled words, "Window left ajar." The cue was never the note. It was the silence after he closed the book, smiled faintly, and extinguished the lamp. In the corridor outside, unseen by him, a shadow paused by his door, listened, and moved on. By the third evening, Greywood Hall had acquired the tense expectancy of a theatre before a premiere. The servants moved with hushed briskness, whispering in corners. Sir Ambrose drank more than usual, but spoke less. Mrs. Carlo stayed in her room, claiming a headache. Inspector Priest prowled the corridors like a man rehearsing cross-examinations. Only Lord Peter Whimsy seemed at ease, wandering about with a notebook and a whimsical smile. At 6:30 he summoned Priest to the library. "Our little opera reaches its finale tonight," he said. "All the props are set. We need only an audience and a stage manager." Priest frowned. "You're playing with fire, Whimsy." "Quite," said Whimsy cheerfully. but fire, when handled properly, illuminates. We must give our culprit the chance to betray himself. He outlined his plan in low tones. Priest's mustache bristled more with each sentence, but in the end, he nodded reluctantly. Very well. But if this goes wrong, then you may arrest me for accessory to theatricals, said Whimsy. Come, Inspector. Curtain up at 7. The music room had been rearranged. The heavy red curtains hung open now, letting in the last light of day. The grand piano had been angled so that its polished flank reflected the tall window. A small lamp burned on the sideboard, its shade tilted to throw a bright oval of light onto the silver salver, which lay exactly where Whimsy had asked it to be placed. Mrs. Carlo sat at the keyboard, pale but determined. Sir Ambrose hovered by the mantelpiece, his hands clasped behind his back. 2 constables stood at discreet points near the doors. Outside, another pair waited by the terrace steps. The hall's atmosphere was charged, like that of an audience before a magician's trick. Whimsy entered last, hat in hand, looking absurdly like a lecturer about to demonstrate a harmless experiment. "Good evening, all," he said. "We are about to recreate the conditions of Mr. Benwick's final evening." But with 1 or 2 subtle improvements, he moved to the piano. "Madame, when I nod, you will play middle C as before. Inspector, your man in the tower will strike the bell at my signal. Everyone else will remain precisely where they are. No movements except those I direct. Agreed?" A murmur of assent. "Splendid." Whimsy closed his eyes briefly, as though listening to an inner metronome. "Then let us begin." He gave a slight nod. Mrs. Carlo struck the note. It rang out clear and cold. She struck it again. Again. The sound filled the room like a held breath. Whimsy raised a hand. "Bell," he said softly. From the tower above came the deep clang, rolling through the hall. The piano's notes seemed to vibrate in sympathy. For a moment the two sounds fused into a single low hum that pressed on the eardrums. Sir Ambrose shifted. The constable stiffened. Mrs. Carlo's hand trembled above the key. Whimsy's voice cut through the hum. And now, the curtain. On cue, a constable at the door pulled the heavy red drapes across the window, darkening the room. In the sudden dimness, Whimsy stepped to one side, out of the lamplight, and vanished behind the piano. A heartbeat later, there was a soft scrape. The window opening. A shadow detached itself from the darkness near the mantelpiece and moved swiftly toward the sill. "Stop!" barked Inspector Priest. The shadow froze. The constables sprang forward and seized the figure. The lamp's light caught a pale, furious face. Sir Ambrose's. He struggled, half snarling. "Let me go." "What is this outrage?" "Merely Act 3, said Whimsy, reappearing from behind the piano. "Bravo, Sir Ambrose. Your timing was exquisite." Sir Ambrose's eyes blazed. "You set a trap." "Not at all," said Whimsy mildly. "I merely allowed the performance to continue. You supplied the finale." They moved the scene to the library, where Sir Ambrose sat in a chair like a dethroned actor, his face drained of color. Priest stood over him, notebook ready. Mrs. Carlo, trembling, clutched a handkerchief. Whimsy remained standing, hands in pockets, as though presiding over a particularly amusing club debate. "You knew Benwick was blackmailing your sister-in-law," Whimsy began. "You feared exposure. You also knew his habits, his experiments with the bell and the piano. You saw an opportunity to silence him under cover of his own ritual." Sir Ambrose said nothing. "You arranged for Mrs. Carlo to play the note, drew the curtains yourself, left the window ajar. While she sat imprisoned at the keyboard, you slipped out, timed your movements to the bell, met Benwick at the terrace, and—" Whimsy made a small, almost graceful gesture with his hand. "Assisted him to the bottom of the steps." Sir Ambrose's mouth twitched. "You can't prove it." "On the contrary," said Whimsy. Your footprints in the moss match the shoes you are wearing now. And you attempted tonight to repeat your exit, perhaps to destroy some lingering evidence, forgetting that we had opened the curtains and placed a lamp to cast your shadow on the salver. Our constables saw you before you reached the sill. Priest leaned forward. Is that true, Sir Ambrose? Sir Ambrose's shoulders sagged. He would have ruined us, he muttered. Ruined the family. Those letters, those debts. He wanted more and more. I thought if I could frighten him off. Frighten, said Whimsy softly. A push at the top of a stair is a poor form of fright. It has too permanent an effect. Sir Ambrose covered his face with his hands. I only meant to. He slipped. The stairs were dry, Whimsy said gently. No slip. Only timing. Timing and a window left ajar. Mrs. Carlo gave a soft cry. Ambrose, why didn't you tell me? He lowered his hands. Because you'd have stopped me. Whimsy closed his notebook. There we have it. A duet turned solo. Inspector, the rest is your province. Later, after Sir Ambrose had been led away and the house had begun to exhale its long-held breath, Whimsy stood alone in the music room. The lamp burned low. He touched the piano key lightly. It gave back a quiet, unthreatening sound. Mrs. Carlo appeared in the doorway, pale but steadier now. It's over, she asked. For you, yes, said Whimsy. For Sir Ambrose, not quite. She stepped into the room. How did you know? Because murder, like music, depends on its rests as much as on its notes, said Whimsy. Everyone heard the bell, everyone saw you at the piano. No one noticed the silence between, but silence tells its own story. She gazed at him. Will you testify? He smiled faintly. I shall do whatever the law requires. And then, I imagine, return to my own piano. Bach is far less exhausting than blackmail. He picked up his hat, gave her a small bow, and walked out into the corridor. Behind him, the piano stood silent, the curtains open to the night. The following morning, Greywood Hall awoke to a new silence, the silence of aftermath. Sir Ambrose had spent the night under constable's guard in the study. Mrs. Carlo had not left her room. The servants crept about as though a curtain had fallen on a play they could scarcely believe they had been part of. Lord Peter Whimsy, immaculate in a grey suit and looking infuriatingly cheerful, assembled everyone in the drawing-room after breakfast. Inspector Priest stood near the mantelpiece, his notebook ready. A constable closed the doors, sealing the group in as if for a final act. Outside, the November light filtered pale and cold through the windows. Ladies and gentlemen, Whimsy began, I'm afraid we must stage one last scene before the curtain truly falls. Last night you saw Sir Ambrose attempt to repeat his exit through the music room window. You may think the case concluded. In fact, what you witnessed was only the coda to a more complicated fugue. He paced slowly, like a lecturer before a blackboard. Mr. Benwick's death was not a crime of sudden temper. It was a performance carefully rehearsed, using sound and timing to create a false picture of reality. Mrs. Carlo at the piano provided the ostinato, the bell in the tower supplied the cue, and the drawn curtains hid the stage from view. Mrs. Carlo, pale but composed, looked at him with wide eyes. Then I was a pawn, said Whimsy gently, but a necessary one. Benwick had discovered the hall's peculiar acoustics. He had you strike that single note because it resonated with the cracked bell above, producing a low hum that traveled through the corridors. He told you it was an experiment. In fact, he was conditioning you, making you predictable at a precise hour. That predictability gave Sir Ambrose his alibi. He could claim you would testify he was nowhere near the terrace, while in truth you could only testify you never saw him leave the room. He turned to Sir Ambrose, who sat stiffly in an armchair, guarded but outwardly calm. You feared Benwick's letters, Sir Ambrose, You feared the exposure of your brother-in-law's debts and your own complicity, so you decided to use his own ritual against him. You instructed Mrs. Carlo to continue playing after he left, drew the curtains yourself, and left the window ajar. While she sat at the keyboard, you slipped out, timed your descent to coincide with the bell, confronted Benwick on the terrace, and pushed him to his death. You then returned the same way, pulling the window to behind you. Sir Ambrose gave a brittle laugh. All very pretty, but you have only speculation. On the contrary, said Whimsy, I have evidence. First, the footprints on the terrace steps. Small, pointed, but the pattern unique to your evening shoes, which you obligingly wore again last night. Second, the missing salver, used as a signaling mirror from the pantry to cue your movements. Third, the altered clock in the kitchen, set deliberately 5 minutes fast so your timing would appear unassailable. And finally, he drew from his pocket a folded sheet, a letter Benwick had prepared for the police. He feared you, Sir Ambrose. He left this in his lodgings in the village. He wrote that if anything happened to him, the person to blame would be the man who had most to lose. He handed the sheet to Priest, who read aloud a few damning lines. A murmur went through the room. Sir Ambrose's face went grey. You see, said Whimsy softly, Benwick was not entirely the villain. Blackmailers are cowards, but not always fools. He sensed you were planning something. He tried to protect himself, but he misjudged the timing, as you misjudged me. Mrs. Carlo gave a small gasp. Then all this time, you were a prisoner of sound, said Whimsy, an unwilling accomplice. But you are free now. Sir Ambrose straightened in his chair. I never meant to kill him, he muttered. I only wanted to frighten him, to make him stop. He slipped. The stairs were dry, said Whimsy, echoing his words from the night before. No slip, only a push. A man can be frightened many ways, Sir Ambrose, but gravity is the surest. Inspector Priest closed his notebook. I think we have heard enough. He nodded to the constable. Take him. Sir Ambrose rose, trembling but dignified, and allowed himself to be led away. As he reached the door, he turned back to Mrs. Carlo. I did it for you, he said hoarsely. You'll never understand. She did not answer. The door closed behind him. The room seemed to exhale. Whimsy moved to the window, looked out at the washed lawns, and then back at the group. And so the fugue ends. A blackmailing copyist, a compromised baronet, a piano key, and a cracked bell. All the ingredients for a Gothic melodrama, except, of course, the supernatural. It was always only timing and acoustics. He gave a small, ironic bow. You may now resume your normal domestic routines. The experiment is concluded. Mrs. Carlo rose, clutching her handkerchief. How can I ever thank you? Whimsy smiled faintly. By playing something other than Middlesea, perhaps a little Debussy. Something with mist but no menace. She gave a tremulous laugh. And you? I. He reached for his hat. I shall take the next train to London, listen to a proper concert, and forget all about bells and windows, though I dare say the newspapers will not let me. Inspector Priest, still scribbling, looked up. You're a curious man, Lord Peter. You talk as though murder were a crossword puzzle. Whimsy's eyes twinkled. A crossword has only one solution, Inspector. Murder usually offers several. One simply has to choose the one that fits the squares. He put on his hat, adjusted it at a rakish angle, and made for the door. Greywood Hall was very still after Sir Ambrose had been taken away. The constables had departed, Inspector Priest had gone to draft his report, and the staff retreated into the kitchen with murmured speculation. Only Lord Peter Whimsy remained in the drawing-room, leaning one elbow on the piano as though it were a lectern. The great black instrument, once a source of torment, sat silent under the half-drawn curtains. Outside, the November wind rattled the ivy against the windows. Mrs. Carlo appeared in the doorway. She had changed from her morning grey gown into a plain blue day dress, and though her face was pale, there was a faint lift at the corners of her mouth, as if some invisible burden had been shifted. She entered hesitantly. "They've gone?" she asked. "They have," said Wimsey, straightening. "Inspector Priest will spend a happy morning in the magistrate's office. Sir Ambrose will spend a less happy one." He gestured to a chair. "You may sit without fear of accusation now." She sank into the armchair, clutching her hands in her lap. "I keep thinking I'll hear that note again," she said, "as if the house remembers it." "Perhaps it does," said Wimsey lightly. "Houses are like people. They develop habits. But habits can be broken." She looked up at him. "You said last night you knew I was innocent. When did you first know?" Wimsey smiled faintly. "When I asked you about the curtains and you answered without understanding why it mattered. A guilty person would have tried to invent an explanation. You simply said you didn't know. Innocence has a refreshing absence of embroidery." She gave a small laugh. "And Sir Ambrose? He embroidered too much," said Wimsey. "Too eager to direct suspicion onto Benwick's debts. Too precise about times he claimed not to notice. And of course, he forgot that a cracked bell can betray more than a conscience. It carries the wrong note at the wrong time." She lowered her gaze. "Ambrose thought he was saving me." "Perhaps," said Wimsey gently. "But murder never saves." "It only shifts the harm." He moved to the window, opened it a little, and let in the cold air. "Do you intend to stay here?" "I don't know," she whispered. "Everything feels poisoned. My husband's debts, Benwick's threats, Ambrose's—" She broke off. Wimsey shut the window softly. "Then you should go somewhere with different bells. London, perhaps. Or Vienna, if you still like music." She looked at him sharply. "How did you—" "Benwick's papers," said Wimsey. "Your husband wrote often to a lady there. You may have friends who will take you in." She gave a slow nod. "You think I can start again?" "Of course," said Wimsey. "The great advantage of surviving a Gothic melodrama is that one is allowed a second act." In the hall outside, a constable's boots echoed. Wimsey opened the door to find Inspector Priest returning unexpectedly. The inspector's face looked troubled. "They're taking Sir Ambrose to town," Priest said. "But halfway down the drive he asked to see you. Says he has something to say." "He's in the coach." Wimsey raised an eyebrow. "An encore?" "Very well." He stepped out into the grey morning. The police coach stood at the edge of the gravel sweep, horses steaming. Inside, Sir Ambrose sat hunched, his hands clasped. He looked older, as though the night had added 10 years. "You wanted me?" Wimsey asked, leaning at the door. Sir Ambrose lifted his head. "Yes, I wanted—" he faltered. "You'll tell them, won't you?" "I never meant it. I only wanted to frighten him." Wimsey regarded him steadily. "You pushed him. You timed it. You prepared the window. That is more than fright." Sir Ambrose's eyes filled with something like tears. "He was ruining us. I thought if I could make him think the house was haunted." "You succeeded," said Wimsey softly. "But you also killed a man. The court may take your intentions into account." "But intention does not unbreak a neck," Sir Ambrose slumped. "I suppose not." He looked away. "Tell her I'm sorry." "I will," said Wimsey. "Goodbye, Sir Ambrose." The baronet gave a short, bitter laugh. "Goodbye, Lord Peter. I always thought you a dilettante, but you're the devil with a magnifying glass." Wimsey tipped his hat. "Merely an amateur of human folly." He stepped back as the coach rolled away down the drive, its wheels crunching on the gravel like the slow beat of a muffled drum. Back inside the hall, Mrs. Carlo waited in the vestibule. "He spoke to you?" she asked. "He did," said Wimsey. "He wanted you to know he is sorry." She closed her eyes. I think he was always sorry. Only too late. Most people are, said Whimsy gently. But you are not obliged to carry his sorrow. She looked at him for a long moment. You speak as if you've seen this before. He gave a slight shrug. Murder has a repetitive rhythm, like a bad tune. One learns the steps, but every case has its own timbre. This one had bells and a piano. The next will have something else. She managed a wan smile. Do you ever tire of it? Sometimes, said Whimsy. Then I go home, pour a drink and play Bach. It restores the proportions. They moved into the music room together. Morning light poured in through the open curtains, falling across the black piano. Mrs. Carlo sat on the bench and let her fingers rest on the keys. Play, said Whimsy softly. She struck a chord. Not middle C, but a gentle cascade of notes, Debussy's Clair de Lune. The sound floated through the room, fragile and unthreatening. She closed her eyes. It feels like air after drowning, she murmured. Whimsy leaned against the mantelpiece, listening. Good. Let the house learn new habits. When the last note faded, he checked his watch. The inspector will return soon with formal papers. I will give my statement and then catch the noon train. You will be free to arrange your affairs. She rose. Thank you, Lord Peter. For everything, he bowed lightly. Thank Bach, madam. I merely took the right note at the right time. In the kitchen, the servants whispered as Whimsy passed. He gave them a cheerful nod, as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying away the last echo of the cracked bell. Greywood Hall stood in the pale sun like a stage after the players have gone. Props still in place, but the drama finished. Whimsy paused on the terrace steps where Benwick had fallen. He looked down at the moss, now undisturbed, and then up at the tower. Every act has its curtain, he murmured. Even this one. He turned back toward the house, whistling a light fragment of Bach, and went inside. A week had passed since Sir Ambrose had been led away down the long drive of Greywood Hall. November had turned sharper, the lawns silvered with frost each morning, and the bell in the tower had fallen silent at last, its cracked tongue removed by workmen. Without its irregular chime, the house seemed lighter, as though a tight band had been loosened round its walls. Lord Peter Whimsy, who had remained a few days to tie up loose ends, was now preparing to depart. In the morning room he found Mrs. Carlo at the window, a shawl about her shoulders. The piano stood open but unplayed. On its music stand lay not manuscripts, but a single daffodil in a tumbler of water, a brave touch of colour against the black wood. "You are leaving today," she said, turning as he entered. "I am," said Whimsy. "London calls. My man Bunter will be most put out if I keep him waiting for another domestic melodrama." She gave a faint smile. "The house feels different now. Quiet, as though it's been exorcised." "Sound can haunt as much as ghosts," said Whimsy lightly. "But once the source is removed, the echo fades." She hesitated. "I keep expecting Ambrose to come through the door." "He will come through a different door for a long time," said Whimsy gently. "The law moves slowly but inevitably." She turned back to the window. "I've decided to sell the Hall. I can't stay here. Everything is touched by what happened." "Wise," said Whimsy. "A house may be stately, but it cannot atone." She looked at him. "I never thanked you properly." "Then play something instead," said Whimsy. "Music does what words cannot." She sat at the piano and began Debussy again, soft and clear, filling the room with a cool, limpid sound. Whimsy listened, eyes half closed. When the last notes died, he gave a small bow. Perfect, a new habit for a new life. Later, in the library, Inspector Priest came to say goodbye. "Case wrapped up neatly," he said, a trace of respect in his gruff voice. "You were right about everything." Whimsy raised an eyebrow. I was right about enough. That will do. Priest closed his notebook. I'll admit, I thought you were chasing shadows with your curtains and clocks. Curtains and clocks are never trivial, said Whimsy. They're the props of daily life. And murder always rehearses with the props at hand. Priest smiled faintly. Will you testify at the trial? If required, said Whimsy. But I prefer to leave the stage after the last act. He adjusted his gloves. Thank you for indulging my eccentricities, Inspector. Eccentricities? Priest chuckled. You solved my case. Good journey, Lord Peter. Whimsy took one last walk through the hall. The servants, who had once watched him with suspicion, now greeted him with shy gratitude. In the kitchen, the cook pressed a small package of biscuits into his hands. For the train, my lord, she said. You've earned it. On the back staircase, he paused, listening. No echo of Middle Sea, no cracked bell, only the faint rattle of teacups and the wind outside. He thought of Benwick, of Sir Ambrose, of Mrs. Carlo, and of how each had been caught in a web of sound and timing until one note had ended the pattern. He stepped out onto the terrace. The mossy steps where Benwick had died were rimed with frost. Above, the tower stood mute, its empty belfry like an open mouth. The winter sun caught the frost and made it sparkle. Whimsy took a deep breath of the cold air. At the gate, Mrs. Carlo waited to see him off. She wore a dark green cloak and looked almost young again. The shadows under her eyes faded. A carriage stood ready to take her to the station as well. We'll be on the same train, she said shyly. I'm going to London to speak with a solicitor. Excellent, said Whimsy. We shall share a compartment and talk of anything but murder. She smiled. I'd like that. He handed her into the carriage, then climbed in himself. As the horses started down the long drive, he looked back at Greywood Hall one last time. In the pale morning it seemed not a house of mystery, but simply a great, aging building with too many memories. The cracked bell lay on its side in the grass, like a fallen helm. You know, he said lightly, I've always thought bells are like people. They may be cracked, but they can still ring. Only one must know how to strike them. Mrs. Carlo looked at him. You speak like a priest. Hardly, said Whimsy, more like an unrepentant choir master. He opened his cigarette case and offered her one. She declined with a smile. For a few minutes they rode in silence, the road crunching under the wheels, hedgerows flicking past. Then she asked softly, Do you ever think about the people you catch? All the time, said Whimsy. I think about what might have saved them before the crime, and what might save the next one. But thinking does not change the past. She looked out the window. Ambrose thought he was saving me. He only destroyed himself. Yes, said Whimsy. He played the wrong note too long. She gave a small sigh. Perhaps we all did. He tapped ash from his cigarette. Then, change the tune, madam. That's the privilege of the living. At the station, he helped her down, arranged for her luggage, and tipped the porter. The train stood ready, steam hissing like a giant kettle. They found a compartment. As the whistle blew and the countryside began to slide past, she said, What will you do next? Return to my flat, said Whimsy. Play some Bach, annoy my man Bunter, perhaps write a letter to my mother, and wait for the next ridiculous invitation to murder. She smiled faintly. You make it sound like a game. It isn't, said Whimsy softly. But one must maintain a certain tone. Otherwise, the dissonance would be too much. They sat in companionable silence, the train clattering over the points. Outside, fields and hedgerows blurred in the winter sun. Whimsy looked out at them, then back at her, and quoted under his breath, If music be the food of love, play on. Mrs. Carlo tilted her head. What's that? "Shakespeare," said Whimsy. "Always appropriate for departures." She smiled. "Thank you, Lord Peter." He inclined his head. "No thanks required. Only play something brighter next time." The train gathered speed, carrying them away from Greywood Hall and the echo of a single note that had once seemed endless. Whimsy leaned back, closed his eyes, and for the first time in days allowed himself to think of nothing at all. 3 months later, the frost had left London, and the city's spring sunshine lay thin and lemon-coloured across the squares. Lord Peter Whimsy strolled down Piccadilly with a newspaper tucked under his arm, a light cane swinging in his hand. His trial work as a witness in the Greywood Hall affair had concluded the previous week. Sir Ambrose had been convicted of manslaughter rather than murder. The jury, moved by his remorse and by Mrs. Carlo's testimony, had recommended mercy. He would serve several years, but not the rest of his life. Benwick had been buried quietly in the village churchyard under a modest stone. Whimsy had attended none of it in person. He disliked the spectacle of punishment. Instead, he had sent a letter to Mrs. Carlo, politely declining her invitation to sit with her in the gallery. "One must not overstay one's part in a play," he had written. "The audience needs to forget the prompter." Now, as he walked, he stopped outside a small music shop and looked in at the window. A young woman inside was trying out a sonata, hesitating over the same bar until she got it right. Whimsy smiled faintly and went in. The bell over the door gave a clear chime, uncracked, unhaunted. "Good morning, my lord," said the shopkeeper, recognizing him. "Looking for anything in particular?" "Merely browsing," said Whimsy. He picked up a volume of Debussy, thumbed through it, and bought it without really noticing. When he stepped back out into the sunshine, he tucked the score under, his arm like a newspaper, and continued on his way. That afternoon he found himself in his flat in Piccadilly, Bunter bringing in tea. "Telegram for you, my lord," said Bunter. Whimsy opened it. It read, "Arrived safely in Vienna. Playing Debussy, not middle C, thank you." C. Whimsy smiled, folded the telegram, and slipped it into his waistcoat pocket. "Excellent," he murmured. "A new tune at last." He moved to the piano in his sitting room, a gleaming Bechstein, and sat down. The afternoon light slanted across the keys. He laid his hands on them and played the opening bars of a Bach fugue, slow and thoughtful, as if feeling for the pattern of a new case hidden in the counterpoint. Bunter, dusting the mantel, paused. "Do you miss the excitement, my lord?" Whimsy's fingers kept moving. "Excitement is overrated, Bunter. One cannot live forever at the same note. Even a fugue must resolve." "Very good, my lord," said Bunter. Whimsy finished the phrase, let the last chord fade, and sat for a moment in silence. The room smelled of tea and polish and spring air. Outside, the city hummed like a great orchestra tuning up. He thought of Greywood Hall, of the cracked bell lying mute in the grass, of Sir Ambrose faltering in the dock, and of Mrs. Carlo beginning again somewhere far away. A dark story, but at least one with a cadence. He stood, poured himself a small drink, and raised it slightly toward the window. "To different keys," he said softly, "and to knowing when to leave the stage." Then he turned back to the piano, picked up the Debussy score, and began to play something light and quick, a piece with no ghosts in it,